Large swaths of the country continue to swelter amid record-breaking heat this summer, including in Arizona, where temperatures in Phoenix have peaked at or above 110 degrees Fahrenheit for the entire month of July. Doctors in the state say health risks are also on the rise, including cases of contact burns, some as severe as second or third degree burns. The Washington Post reports that one toddler named Mason accidentally slipped through a pet door, stepped onto a concrete patio, and was, quote, screaming within seconds. Mason suffered second-degree burns on the soles of his feet, and when his parents took him to an area hospital, they, quote, met another toddler with burned feet. Over in Texas, construction workers are protesting after Republican Governor Greg Abbott signed a law in June that removed mandates for water breaks for outdoor workers, just as the heat wave began to punish the state. Researchers say human-driven climate change makes extreme heat like this at least 5 times more likely. And this month, July 2023, is on course to become the world's hottest month in hundreds, if not thousands of years, according to one NASA scientist. Also, there's this. Heat is the #1 weather-related cause of death in the United States. #1. It often kills more people than hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes combined. And as the new book, The Heat Will Kill You First, points out, heat is a silent, overlooked danger. Quote, when heat comes, it's invisible. It doesn't bend tree branches or blow hair across your face to let you know it's arrived. The ground doesn't shake. It just surrounds you and works on you in ways that you can't anticipate or control. Joining us now is the author of that prescient book, The Heat Will Kill You First, Jeff Goodell. Jeff, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Jonathan.
So as you know, heat domes happen when the atmosphere traps hot ocean air over an area like a lid on a pot. You live in Texas, where heat is particularly dangerous for a number of reasons, including the power grid. Can you explain to everyone why the solution cannot simply be crank up the AC?
You know, we all love a techno fix, right? We all would like it to be that simple that we just, you know, when it gets hot, you just turn on the AC. But in fact, AC is not the solution to this. You know, first of all, there are billions of people on this planet who don't have AC and will never have AC. While I was reporting this book, I spent a lot of time with people in poor communities who maybe did have AC but couldn't afford to run it, or could maybe afford to run it for an hour, and were trying to decide whether they should run the AC or have enough money to buy dinner. And so it's a huge burden. More importantly, you know, we're not going to air condition the oceans. You know, we're not going to air condition the wheat fields where our food is grown. We're not going to air condition the cornfields. And finally, the other really important point is that, you know, in Texas here where I live, we had a blackout a couple of years ago where I was without power for 5 days. If something like that happened during one of these extreme heat events, all of a sudden the air conditioning would stop, and we would have it would be a massive consequences. We'd have what one infrastructure expert I talked to called a heat Katrina, referring to Hurricane Katrina.
You know, it's clear that local, state, and federal aid programs need to do more to mitigate heat-related risks. What are some things that can be done in the short term?
Well, I mean, there's a whole range of things. I mean, you can start with simple things. You know, cities are much hotter than the rural regions around them, so a lot of the efforts are focused on how to cool cities off. You know, some of the simplest things are, you know, more planting of street trees so that you have more shade, more green spaces for people to get to, opening of cooling centers so that people who don't have air conditioning have cool spaces to go to. You have cities that are doing larger infrastructure projects like, you know, Athens, Greece is rebuilding a Roman aqueduct in order to bring more water into the center of the city. to allow more green space and more planting, democratizing air conditioning so that so that it's cheaper and people aren't worried about having their power turned off. I mean, heat deaths are avoidable. We can change how we message about heat, how we talk about it. We all know hurricanes and things have ratings. We don't do that for heat waves. And we in the media can get a lot better at it because we often talk about heat waves and show pictures of kids, playing in sprinklers or hanging out at the beach. And we don't really communicate the scale and urgency of the threat.
Well, speaking of the scale and urgency of the threat, I mean, the heat's not exclusive to the United States. Europe, Asia, the Middle East, North Africa are all experiencing massive heat waves this summer. What type of ripple effect does this have? Do the heat waves happening in Asia and here in the United States, do they have impacts on each other, or are these all separate heat domes acting independently of each other?
Well, they're all separate, but they're all a consequence of the changes that are happening in our atmosphere. As we add more and more CO2 to the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels, it is heating up our atmosphere, which is changing the kind of dynamics. The Arctic is heating 4 times faster than the rest of the planet, which is changing where the jet stream goes. The jet stream kind of gets wiggly, and it creates these heat domes where the heat these high pressure zones are kind of locked in. So they're separate, but they're all a consequence of this new climate we're creating by loading it up with CO2.
So, Mr. Goodell, experts say this is just the beginning. This may actually be one of the cooler summers of our lifetimes. Do the scientists and the experts you talk to still think there's time to course correct?
Yes, there's a lot of time to course correct. This is not a are we doomed or are we not question. Everything that we do to reduce CO2 emissions right now helps to lower the temperature of the planet in the long run and helps to reduce the impacts. But I think what we're seeing now is a signal that this is happening now. It's happening fast. This is an emergency. This global warming, climate change is not something that's happening far off in the distance to people that are living in the future or in some other place. It is happening to us. We need to get serious about it. And this is what this summer is about, I think.
Jeff Goodell, whose new book, The Heat Will Kill You First, is out now. Today, Alabama state Republicans defied the Supreme Court of the United States and voted against redrawing congressional maps that would accurately represent black voters. Right now in Alabama, only 1 of the 7 congressional districts is majority black, even though more than a quarter of Alabama's population is African American. Last month, the Supreme Court agreed with a lower court ruling from at least 2 Trump appointees that found that Alabama's map violated the Voting Rights Act by denying minority voters an equal opportunity to elect representatives of their choice. The decision called on the Alabama legislature to draw an additional district, making black voters the majority of the voting age population, or, quote, something quite close to it. So Alabama Republicans had to go back to the drawing board. And today, after long sessions of negotiations and huddling over dueling maps represented by Republicans in both chambers, presented by Republicans in both chambers, legislators adopted their final proposal, a map that still doesn't do what the Supreme Court said. You can see it right here. First, it drops the percentage of black voters in the only majority black district from 55% to nearly 51%. And it adds a new district where black voters will only make up about 40% of the voting age population. That's neither the majority nor something quite close to it. The governor of Alabama just signed that map into law, leaving black voters in Alabama back at square one. Joining us now, Tona Boyd, Associate Director Counsel of the Legal Defense Fund, one of the groups that brought the Alabama case to the Supreme Court on behalf of the plaintiffs. Tona, it's great to see you. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you for having me.
So as a litigant for the case, what's your initial reaction to Republicans in Alabama ignoring the Supreme Court ruling?
Listen, Jonathan, what the Alabama legislature has done is appalling. It's lawless and it's undemocratic. As you just stated, both the district court and the United States Supreme Court were clear about what Alabama must do, and that's create a second district where black voters have the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. And instead, what Alabama did is appalling. But you know what? It is not.
Go ahead.
It's not new. We've seen this from Alabama before. We've seen this movie before. I mean, recall back to the 60s when, yet again, Alabama defied a court order designed to fully enfranchise and give blacks the opportunities that they deserved. I mean, this was an infamous moment in which George Wallace stood and tried to block students from integrating the University of Alabama, and did that in defiance of a court order. So Alabama has done this before, but they didn't succeed then, and they won't succeed now.
So then the new map, is likely to be rejected by the district court that struck down Alabama's first map. So if that happens, what happens next?
I think that's right. So first of all, although Alabama is acting as though they're above the law, they are not. This map is going to go back to the same district court that rejected their discriminatory map before. That court will then evaluate that, and we will be there to object to that map. And then the court will likely have the option to appoint a special master who will then come up with a map that comports with the court's order. So Alabama will not have, this is not the last word or the last step in this journey.
What is LDF ready to do to block Republicans from denying black voters in Alabama a chance at equal representation?
Listen, we are going to continue to fight as we have for the past 2 years to ensure that black Alabamians have the representation that they deserve and that they have a map that is fair. So we are already mobilized to object to the map that has been put forth thus far. We will continue to fight in court. But I've got to say, we can't only fight this battle on one front. We've also got to fight to fully restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act so that these type of antics that the Alabama legislature has gotten up to don't continue to persist.
So how could this new map reverberate across the country, especially with other states in the South confronting similar voting rights challenges?
I think the message is going to be clear. Jonathan, we're going to continue to fight because this map cannot and should not stand. Both the district court and the Supreme Court were clear, and so we're going to continue to fight, and that's here in Alabama and elsewhere where folks are continuing to try to subvert the will of black voters.
Tona, as I was reading the story about what is happening in Alabama and Alabama defying a Supreme Court ruling, I went back to the Supreme Court ruling in Brown v. Board of Education. Correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't the Supreme Court have to do another ruling where they put in there that they had to desegregate the schools, quote, with all deliberate speed? Do I have my history right?
You do, Jonathan. And I have to say, it couldn't be more important in this case that we act quickly to ensure that Alabamians have the fair representation that they deserve, because you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And once an unfair map is in place and allows to persist, the harm is irreparable. We already saw that with the 2022 election when Alabamians were forced to vote under an unfair map. We cannot and will not let that happen again. And we have to act, as the court has said before, with all deliberate speed.
Adults know what slavery really involved. It involved rape. It involved torture. It involved taking a baby from their mother. How is it that anyone could suggest that in the midst of these atrocities, that there was any benefit to being subjected to this level of dehumanization.
That was Kamala Harris, the country's first black vice president, in Jacksonville, Florida today, saying something that should not be up for debate. The vice president's speech comes as Florida faces backlash over new standards for teaching black history in public schools. Those standards require middle schoolers to learn that enslaved people, quote, developed skills that personally benefited them. The State Department of Education has responded to criticism with a statement that reads, in part, the intent of this particular benchmark clarification is to show that some slaves developed highly specialized trades from which they benefited. That statement lists 16 people who allegedly benefited from their enslavement, but at least 6 of those people were never enslaved. It specifically names Ned Cobb, and while the Department of Education is not specific about which Ned Cobb they have listed, history books across the country teach about a Ned Cobb who was born in Alabama in 1885, the son of an enslaved man. The skill he learned was farming, and he used that skill to escape the financial binds of sharecropping, if you can call that a personal benefit. Joining us now, Tremaine Lee, MSNBC correspondent and Into America podcast host. Tremaine, thank you for making time for us tonight.
Thanks so much, Jonathan.
So today we heard the country's first black vice president come out and say slavery is wrong. What do you make of the necessity of that statement in the year 2023?
Jonathan, perhaps the saddest part is that it actually has to be stated in 2023. Whether you're talking about 1923 or 2023, there has been this battle over this narrative that slavery simply wasn't that bad, right? That black people have been complaining and there was a war fought over it, and it wasn't that bad. There were some good slave owners, that there was an acceptable degree of rape, an acceptable degree of human trafficking. And we call it slavery, and we've seen these pictures and read these stories about this, the genteel South and the plantation and merry Negroes playing their violins. But in fact, these were forced labor camps where people were systematically raped, separated from their children. But the fact of the matter is that that narrative still pervades. And there's a huge faction of this country that does not want to not just accept the history of this country, because accepting the history means you have to accept and respect the experiences that black people have experienced in this country, but also they have to take a look in the mirror and see the horrors and violence heaped upon black people by white society.
Right, and that's really hard for a lot of folks. You know, Tremaine, we Googled the names that Florida's Department of Education holds up as examples of people who benefited from slavery. One of them seems to refer to George Washington's sister. 6 of them were never enslaved. What do you make of that?
Well, really, it doesn't matter who these people are. They're stand-ins. And I think one telling moment was there was a spokesman for Governor Ron DeSantis who tweeted in response to VP Harris's speech, who said her mother is Indian. Her father is of Jamaican descent, who they say admitted that they also descend from a slave owner. And they pointed to that to say she wasn't descended from slaves, the complete opposite, as if millions of people in this country have not been are not descendants of people who were inseminated through rape by white slave masters, right? And so it doesn't matter. The facts don't matter. The names don't matter. The fact is that they want to be able to use folks as a target to dehumanize and illegitimize the experience of black people in this country. And at least the most cynical view on this is that they're doing this purely for political gain, because they know there's a huge segment of voters in this country who are cheering this stuff on, because that means they look at the entitlements, they look at the welfare state, they look at black folks, they look at affirmative action, they look at folks having to feel, quote unquote, guilty about the role that their ancestors played in this country. And so, again, the facts really don't matter. But isn't that, perfect in this broad culture war that folks are in about the truth, that they'll use lies and misinformation to kind of propel their side? It fits perfectly.
Yeah, and Tremaine, one more question for you. Earlier this year, you went to Florida and spoke to people who are trying to educate students on black history outside of the classroom. What are they saying about the changes to Florida's curriculum?
One thing that I kind of expected, but to hear it from generations of families who say they feel actually attacked. Folks, especially from the South, who've grown up hearing the stories about so much of the violence and all of the barriers set up between Black people who descended from enslaved people to finally get a taste of freedom and try to build communities and educate their children, to have those stories wiped away, it felt personal to a lot of people. And so they say, like, you know, as so many of us have heard time and again, that no one is going to save us but us. And so for the group of folks that led by Professor Marvin Dunn, who going through these Teach the Truth tours, taking people actually in the footsteps of history so that history will never be lost, John.